Okay, getting back to some of the trade-offs that I was talking about before with, packing people in areas, um, and using gray infrastructure. I'm going to use now an agricultural example because I'm going to refer to this chart a little bit later on and look at an urban landscape example. But this is a paper by Foley et al. In 2005, and you see these diagrams are what they call rose diagrams, and each one of these bars represents an ecosystem service. And so a natural system's got all those ecosystem services. You can see them there, except for crop production. So we take that landscape, when we do intensive cropland, we get a very simple system just with crop production. But we can also design those systems so that there's more diversity, and you can still get crop production, but you can also restore some of those other ecosystem services. So that's what I call multiple function landscape. And that's what we hope to attain in an urban system. And we'll come back to that. Here's some data to show that this is how possible this is. And so this is data from the Kellogg Biological Station, LTER, where they looked at crop systems, and in a no-till situation is they've minimized the disturbances to plant and to harvest. And you can see that this is trace gas emissions on the x-axis. And so you can see that with a no-till situation, you can do pretty well. And comparing that to unmanaged systems, there are actually sinks for these gases. But it does show that you can manage these systems so that you can get less infiltration, less emissions, I'm sorry. And so can we do this then in an urbanized situation? In an urbanized situation, we have, in the United States anyway, mostly a lot of turf grass out there in the system. And so if we can convert some of those turf grass systems into a microforest, this would be an objective. And so just to give you an example of how this can work, we did some comparisons of a forested ecosystem that was right next to a turf grass system, a whole neighborhood. And we looked at organic matter, porosity, saturated infiltration rate, and bulk density. Bulk density is a measure of how compact the soil is. The more compact, the fewer services you're getting from that system. And in all cases, the forest soil was providing way more, significantly more ecosystem services than that turf grass system. Now, the turf grass does provide some cultural services, but this was just from a perspective of the soil. So this then leads us to a discussion on the importance of urban soil. And if you haven't figured out already, that it is a foundation for many ecological processes. You saw all of those ecosystem services that we got in an urban landscape. The foundation was soil. So it's nutrient cycling, carbon storage. There's way more carbon stored in the soil than there is globally than there is in the atmosphere, for example. The water cycle, plant health, and on and on. I like to think of soil as brown infrastructure in an urban context. And so in that situation, there's a plant growth medium, so it's important for plants. Water infiltration and storage, I gave you an example of that. Also a sink for pollutants. Pollutants can accumulate in soils, keeping them out of the air and out of water. Of course, storage of nutrients. And engineers have to know about the soil because they build structures. And so, and the big thing about soil is that it's a hotspot for biodiversity. And E.O. Wilson called soil the poor man's tropical rainforest because there's so much diversity there. And then on top of all of that is that in an urban context, we have the juxtaposition of the soil to people. And so if you have a contaminated soil at the surface, that then becomes a public health issue. It helps provide amenities. Again, turf grass systems, as bad as they are for providing services, they do provide an amenity for humans. I like to play baseball, for example. And then also having 80% of the population in the United States near urban areas, it also provides an educational opportunity. You can teach ecology, biology, physics, chemistry, all looking at soils. Okay, going back to our rosebud diagram, how do we restore ecosystem services in these landscapes? And again, we have this multi-functioning natural system. We converted to an urban system that were sanitary cities, if you recall, that engineers have designed to maintain a healthy situation so that people aren't getting, cholera and things like that. But in this case, we're only getting runoff as a service. But if we go with a use of green and brown infrastructure, we can get this multi-functioning landscape. And if we engineer them right, we can get hyper-functioning landscapes as well. So not only are you going to get an infiltrating water infiltration into a soil that's a natural soil, but we can engineer soil so that you can actually increase the rate of infiltration. So that's where that hyper comes from. And so the question then is, if we could put microforests in the landscape, can we also do the same thing? Okay, sorry for those. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about soil in general. Got the context, okay, for this ecosystem services. And basically, soil scientists think of 5 different factors that influence soil and how it varies spatially on the landscape and also at depth. So we're talking 3D here, 2-dimension spatially on the surface, but also in depth. And if we have an understanding of the climate, the parent material would be what the soil is being formed from, the kind of rock, for example, relief or topography, how long the system's been exposed. So you have 100-year soils compared to, 100,000-year soils. What organisms are there? And that mostly relates to the type of vegetation. And so Hans Janny in 1941 came up with this kind of equation, it's more of a theoretical equation that, these factors, you have an understanding of them, you can have a pretty good understanding of what kind of soil you're going to have. So where do humans fit into this? And that's why the cartoon there, humans. So we look at a landscape, and if a soil scientist knows the slope position, has an understanding of slope position, parent material, how long these soils have been exposed to the environment, they can map hundreds of acres of soil in a day once they get the relationship down and they know where those parent materials are. But in an urban situation, throw that all out the window. So we have slope position, age, and they can do that. So what about the spatial variability of urban soils? Well, urban soils are managed, they're disturbed, they're intensively used, and lots of transported materials are being pushed around in a landscape. That's really hard for a soil scientist to get a good understanding of what's going on. And so this has been an active area of research for urban soil scientists. And of course, where do remnant and microforests fall into this? So now, because humans can really muck up the soil landscape, we've added a new factor, the anthropogenic factor, A. So now we have 6 factors that have impacts on soil formation. And we have to look at it in a different context, however. So we can think of it from a direct effect, and I'll talk more about this later, of disturbance and management. That's a direct effect. They're short-term, has immediate impact on the soil. Essentially, the A factor, in that case, swamps out the other factors, right? Because you're out there with a bulldozer, whatever, you're really just wiping out the topography, so that T then becomes insignificant. And then if we have a change in environment, which I put under the category of an indirect effect, that's working much more within the constraint of the other time constraint of the other factors. So they're interacting rather than one overlying the other, if that makes any sense. So we're relatively short, the A dominates. relatively long, the A interacts. And then that's the temporal component. Then there's a spatial component. And essentially, we have the indirect effects and the direct effects. Direct effects in the United States, the early European settlers, when they first got here, they immediately started to parcelize the landscape. I own this, you own that, whatever. And they start doing their separate things in those ownership categories. Native Americans didn't have that kind of concept of land ownership. And so that parcelization immediately resulted in fragmentation. They introduced new disturbance regimes and new management. And then you overlap that with the indirect effects. So we have altered climate. Cities are warmer than the surrounding area, for example. Pollution, introduction of exotic species. And so you overlay these on top of each other and you get what I call an urban mosaic. And so we'll come back to that and I'll show you a picture of that later. So what are some indirect effects in urban areas? We have altered temperature regimes. We have altered soil moisture regimes. There's elevated CO2, pollution stress, non-native species introductions. These include soil organisms, by the way, not just plants. And there's all kinds of atmospheric deposition going on. And so one of the things that we've argued to use urban areas for is in study, soils response to climate change. We can use these urban areas as an analog for climate change. That's a whole nother talk, but I just wanted to make that point. So soil disturbance effects, these are direct effects. And soil physical disturbance, we're mixing, we're compacting, and we're disrupting soil aggregates. The soils, form these little clods that you see in the soil. Those are aggregates. They're really important for soil moisture retention. And when we disturb these soils, those all disappear. We bury soils, we transport them, and we cover them. And so we think about landfill, impervious surfaces, all results in a reduced aeration and infiltration. Now we're getting back to the urban mosaic. And this is what I call the new heterogeneity. So remember that figure I showed earlier, if a soil scientist understood topography, understood parent material, and understood the amount of time and vegetation cover and things like that, they can map lots of soil in a day. Well, forget about that in an urban landscape. And so this urban mosaic represents what I call new heterogeneity. And a lot of people were saying that urban soils are there's way more heterogeneity in an urban landscape than there is in a non-urban landscape. But actually, that depends on your scale of observation. You can actually have, like in the upper right-hand side there, that's Central Park in New York City. That area is being managed and maintained very similarly. And so there's not a lot of variability out there. If you had a forest that was the size of that turfgrass system, there would be a lot more variability. So it depends on your scale of observation. But the idea here is that there's a new heterogeneity, and we have to get an understanding of that. And of course, microforests fit in there as well. But those microforests, as I'll point out later, are being more impacted by indirect effects. So we end up with this continuum of habitat conditions from naturalized systems to highly cultivated, highly impacted systems. I'm not going to go into this too much. So you can think about the ecosystem services you might get from this. And of course, microforests are more of a naturalized system. You're going to be getting ecosystem services that you can't get or won't get in, say, a street tree situation. So and I gave you a lot there on the urban soil mosaic because for me and for my colleagues for the last 20 or 30 years, we've utilized the urban mosaic as a natural experiment. We can't go out there. You can, but it's really hard to go out there and disturb soils, large areas of soil, and then go out there and see what the impact was. That's, we like to experiment that way, but we can't do that where people live. And so what we do is we delineate the landscape based on all these different factors, and we could utilize them as an experiment. And so in the one case on the top, we're looking at indirect effects. We're going to take microforests or small remnant forests in an urban context, and we'll compare them with a small forest in a rural context. And in that case, the A factor varies, and that would be the indirect effects, mostly environmental. While the other factors, you try to keep them as equal as possible. Then you can look at the impact of those indirect effects. We can also do chronosequences, and this is where the T factor varies. And so we can look at landfill that's 10 years old compared to landfill that's 100 years old, if that makes any sense. And we can also break it out by land use and cover. So we can compare, and I showed you an example before, turf grass versus a forest patch, for example, and so on and so forth. Those are the natural experiments. And we could look at various aspects of soil development. So I'm going to give you an example. This was actually my dissertation work in New York City. I set up an anthroposequence, and let me go back here on the top there. That's an anthroposequence. So it's an indirect effect I'm looking at, keeping the other factors equal. I was able to do that in New York City metropolitan area, going from the Bronx, New York into Connecticut, all the same vegetation, all the same parent material, slope position, that sort of thing. The only thing that differed was the context of that forest. Whether it was, this is the New York Botanical Garden forest, the lower left, that was one of my sites. And you can see the context there versus a rural forest out in Connecticut. And you can see that there's just more forest. And so we can look at this as an urban-rural gradient. Now, this is a direct approach, a direct gradient approach. I use distance as a surrogate for urban. And so we looked at just, I could show you data for days on this, but I'm just going to give you a couple examples. This is forest through fall nitrogen. So nitrogen coming from the atmosphere into a forest, mostly by precipitation, but also by dry deposition. And you can see in the urban, total inorganic nitrogen is a lot higher than the suburban and the rural. That rural got a little blip because there was a power, I didn't know this, but there was a power plant not far from some of my sites. And so there was a little bit more nitrogen coming in there than in the suburban. So you can see that there's this urban-rural gradient of nitrogen deposition. And we also found a similar pattern with calcium. And think about that. Where's that calcium coming from? Well, if you think about all that concrete that I was talking about before, that engineers use for gray infrastructure, well, that stuff decomposes and it gets mixed into the environment. And we think that's why we had a little bit more calcium coming in the urban versus the rural. And so we think about sources, mostly fossil fuel combustion.